The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and fear. James Johnson sat in the vinyl chair beside his wife's bed, watching her chest rise and fall with the rhythm of exhausted sleep. The 4-drip counted seconds in crystalline drops, each one a reminder that time had become their most precious currency. Outside the window, the city continued its indifferent dance, lights blinking on as dusk settled over the skyline like a bruise. Sarah had been diagnosed 6 months ago. Stage 3 breast cancer. The words had hit James like a freight train, stealing the air from his lungs and replacing it with ice. He remembered that day with painful clarity. The oncologist's measured tone, Sarah's trembling hands, the way the fluorescent lights had seemed too bright, too cruel. Their children, Emma and Noah, had been at school, blissfully unaware that their world was about to fracture. James had quit his job the next week. He'd been an architect at a promising firm downtown, designing buildings that would outlast him, structures that spoke of permanence and vision. But none of that mattered when Sarah couldn't lift her head from the pillow, when the chemotherapy turned her vibrant energy into something fragile and flickering. His boss had been understanding at first, then disappointed, then quietly resentful. James hadn't cared. He'd cashed out his retirement fund, borrowed money from his brother Marcus, and dedicated every waking moment to Sarah's survival. The treatments were brutal. James learned to recognize the pattern. The days after chemo when Sarah would vomit until there was nothing left, when even water tasted like poison. He'd hold her hair, rub her back, whisper reassurances that felt hollow even as he spoke them. He learned to cook meals that wouldn't trigger her nausea, soft bland things that tasted like cardboard but stayed down. He learned to give injections, to monitor her blood counts, to recognize the signs of infection that could kill her faster than the cancer itself. Emma, their 12-year-old daughter, had retreated into silence. She'd stopped playing piano, stopped meeting friends, stopped doing anything but sketching in her journal, dark, swirling images that James couldn't bear to examine too closely. Noah, only 8, asked questions constantly. Why is Mommy sick? When will she be better? Did I make her sick? James answered with patience he didn't feel, creating fairy tales of recovery while terror clawed at his throat. The financial devastation came quickly. Medical bills stacked up like accusations. $47,000, $83,000, $126,000. Insurance covered some, but not enough. Never enough. James sold their second car, then his photography equipment, the vintage camera collection he'd spent 15 years building. He sold Sarah's jewelry, the pieces her grandmother had left her, though it broke something in him to do it. He borrowed from friends who said they understood but whose eyes held pity and doubt. Marcus had been their lifeline. James's older brother worked construction and had 3 kids of his own, but he showed up every Sunday with groceries and took Emma and Noah to the park, giving them a few hours of normalcy. "You're doing the right thing," Marcus would say, gripping James's shoulder with calloused hands. "Family first. Always." James wanted to believe him. Sarah's mother, Patricia, visited twice a week, but the visits left everyone exhausted. Patricia meant well, but she couldn't hide her disapproval of how James managed things. "You should have kept working," she'd say. "You need stability. What will you do when she's better?" The words hung in the air like smoke, and James would clench his jaw and say nothing, because what could he say? That he was terrified Sarah wouldn't get better? That every choice felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss? There were good days scattered among the horror. Days when Sarah would smile and ask about the children's homework, when she'd manage a few bites of soup and keep it down. Days when James could almost pretend they were going to make it through this intact. On those days, he'd read to her from the novel she'd been in the middle of when the diagnosis came, a romance about second chances and redemption. Sarah would close her eyes and drift, and James would study her face, memorizing every detail as if he could hold her in the world through sheer force of will. The surgery came after months of chemotherapy had shrunk the tumors enough to operate. James paced the waiting room for 7 hours, drinking coffee that tasted like mud and reading the same magazine article a dozen times without absorbing a single word. Marcus sat beside him, silent and solid. When the surgeon finally emerged with good news, they'd gotten clear margins. The lymph nodes looked clean. James had wept openly, not caring who saw. Recovery was its own kind of hell. Sarah's body had been through war, and it showed. She moved like someone much older, each step calculated and careful. The scar across her chest was angry and red, a testament to survival that felt more like mutilation. James helped her dress, helped her bathe, never flinching, though sometimes he wanted to scream at the unfairness of it all. She was only 36. They were supposed to have decades left. Radiation therapy followed, 5 days a week for 6 weeks. James drove her to every appointment, sat in waiting rooms decorated with watercolor paintings and fake plants, made small talk with other caregivers who wore the same haunted expression he saw in his own mirror. The radiation burned Sarah's skin, left it raw and weeping. James applied ointment with gentle fingers, each touch a prayer. Throughout it all, he neglected himself completely. He lost 30 pounds without noticing, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been athletic and strong. He stopped exercising, stopped seeing friends, stopped doing anything that wasn't directly related to Sarah's care or the children's basic needs. His world condensed to a single point: keeping his wife alive. The oncologist's words, when they finally came, felt unreal. The scans are clear. No evidence of disease. You can ring the bell. There was a bell in the cancer center, a brass thing that survivors rang to celebrate the end of treatment. Sarah rang it with trembling hands while nurses applauded and James stood behind her, unable to process that they'd actually made it. Emma and Noah jumped up and down, their joy uncomplicated and pure, and for a moment, everything felt possible again. The weeks after treatment ended should have been celebration, but instead they felt like standing in the eye of a hurricane. Sarah slept 14 hours a day, her body demanding rest after months of being poisoned in the name of healing. James threw himself into rebuilding their life. He updated his resume, reached out to old contacts, tried to explain the gap in his employment without sounding desperate. The responses were polite but firm. They'd gone with other candidates. They'd keep his resume on file. They wished him luck. Money was suffocating them. The medical bills hadn't stopped just because treatment had. There were follow-up appointments, medications, physical therapy. James took a job at a big-box hardware store, working the early shift stocking shelves for $12 an hour. It was humiliating work for someone with his education and experience, but it was work. He smiled at customers who didn't see him, lifted boxes until his back screamed, and brought home paychecks that barely covered groceries. Sarah started to regain strength slowly. Color returned to her cheeks, and she could walk to the mailbox without needing a nap afterward. James watched her with gratitude so intense it felt like pain. They'd done it. They'd beaten the monster. Everything else could be rebuilt. But Sarah was different. James noticed it in small ways at first. How she'd turn away when he tried to kiss her. How her eyes would go distant during dinner conversations. He told himself it was trauma, that she needed time to process what had happened to her body, to her sense of self. Cancer survivors often struggled with depression and anxiety. It was normal. It would pass. She started going out more. Coffee with friends, support groups, long walks alone. James encouraged it, thought it meant she was healing. He'd stay home with Emma and Noah, helping with homework and making dinner, grateful that Sarah was reclaiming pieces of herself. Marcus mentioned seeing her at a cafe downtown one afternoon, sitting across from a man Marcus didn't recognize. Probably just a friend from her support group, James had said, and Marcus had nodded slowly, his expression troubled. The truth came on a Tuesday evening in late spring. Sarah had asked James to meet her in the kitchen after the kids went to bed. She'd made tea, which should have been his first warning. Sarah only made tea for difficult conversations. They sat across from each other at the table James had built with his own hands when they'd first bought the house, back when everything had seemed full of promise. "I need to talk to you about something," Sarah said, and her voice was steady, rehearsed. James felt his stomach drop, that primal instinct that knows disaster before the conscious mind can catch up. "Okay," he said carefully. Sarah looked at her tea, not at him. "I'm grateful for everything you did during my treatment. You saved my life, James. I know that." The but hung in the air between them, unspoken but deafening. "But I can't stay in this marriage anymore. I want a divorce." The words landed like physical blows. James stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "What?" "I've been thinking about this for months. Going through cancer, it changed me. It made me realize life is too short to settle. I need more. I deserve more." "Settle?" James's voice cracked. "Sarah, what are you talking about? I gave up everything for you. My career, my savings, everything I had." "I know." Her tone was matter-of-fact, almost clinical. "And I appreciate it. But that doesn't mean I owe you the rest of my life. You became a caretaker, James. Not a partner. Not a lover. Just someone who managed my illness." James felt like he was falling, the ground dropping away beneath him. "That's not fair. You were dying. I did what needed to be done to keep you alive. And now I'm not dying." Sarah finally looked at him, and her eyes were cool, determined. "I want to live, really live. I've met someone who makes me feel alive, who sees me as more than a sick person who needs to be managed." The affair revelation felt almost secondary to the betrayal of everything else. "You've been cheating on me? While I was working myself to death to pay for your treatment." "It's not like that. Robert and we connected on a deeper level. He understands what I need." "Robert?" James tasted the name like ashes. "Who the hell is Robert?" "He's a motivational speaker I met at a survivor's seminar. He's successful, stable. He knows how to live fully." Sarah paused, then delivered the final blow. "And I'm taking Emma and Noah." James stood so abruptly his chair fell backward. "Like hell you are. I'm their mother. I have primary custody rights. You don't even have a real job, James. You can barely support yourself. How are you going to provide for 2 children? I sacrificed my career to save your life." His voice rose to a shout, months of exhaustion and stress finally breaking through. "I sold everything I owned. I borrowed money we can't repay. I held you while you vomited blood. I changed your bandages. I slept in hospital chairs for weeks. And you think you can just take my children because you found someone better?" Sarah stood too, her face hardening. "You made those choices. I didn't ask you to quit your job. You decided to be a martyr, and now you want me to feel guilty for wanting something better for myself and my children." "Our children," James corrected, his voice breaking. "They're our children, Sarah. You can't just erase me because I'm not successful enough anymore. I can and I will. Robert has already offered to help with everything, a good school for Emma, therapy for Noah. He can give them stability. What can you give them? A father who stocks shelves and lives in denial." James felt tears on his cheeks and didn't care. "I love them. That's what I can give them. And I love you, despite everything you're saying right now. We can work through this." "I don't love you anymore." Sarah said it simply, as if commenting on the weather. "Maybe I never did the way I should have. Cancer gave me clarity, James. I want a better life. I want a better man. And I'm going to have both." She walked out of the kitchen, leaving James standing among the ruins of everything he'd fought for. Upstairs, he could hear Emma's music playing softly, Noah's voice asking their mother a question. Normal sounds from a life that was about to be shattered. James sank to the floor, his back against the cabinets, and let himself break. The divorce proceedings were a nightmare wrapped in bureaucratic cruelty. Sarah's lawyer was expensive and ruthless, painting James as an unemployed dreamer who'd made reckless financial decisions. The fact that those decisions had saved Sarah's life was dismissed as irrelevant to his current ability to provide for children. James couldn't afford a lawyer of that caliber, so he worked with a harried public defender who juggled 50 cases and barely remembered his name. Robert appeared at the courthouse during one of the hearings, sitting behind Sarah with his hand on her shoulder. He was everything James wasn't anymore. Polished, confident, wearing a suit that cost more than James made in a month. Robert smiled at the judge, at Sarah's lawyer, at everyone except James. When their eyes met, James saw pity in them, and it was worse than hatred. Emma stopped talking to him. Sarah had told the children that Daddy hadn't been able to keep his job, that they needed to live somewhere more stable. Emma, old enough to understand the implications, looked at James with confusion and disappointment. "Why did you give up everything, Dad?" she asked one night during his court-appointed visitation. "Mom says you made bad choices." "I made the choices I thought were right," James said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I couldn't let your mother die, Emma. Would you have wanted me to? But now she's with Robert, and we have to move, and you're all alone." Emma's voice cracked. Was it worth it? The question haunted him. Noah was too young to fully understand, but he sensed the tension and acted out. Tantrums, nightmares, clinging to James during their brief visits only to be pried away when it was time to go back to Sarah. Each separation felt like being torn in half. James kept working at the hardware store, but he also started freelancing late at night, doing small architectural drafts for contractors who paid in cash. He slept 4 hours a night, fueled by coffee and desperation. He needed to prove he could provide, that he wasn't the failure Sarah's lawyer portrayed him as. Marcus remained his only steady support. "This is wrong, man," Marcus said one Sunday, watching Emma and Noah play in his backyard while James sat on the porch steps, hollow-eyed. "What she's doing, it's evil. You saved her life. The court doesn't care about that. They care about income and stability." James watched his children, memorizing how Noah's laugh sounded, how Emma tucked her hair behind her ear when she was thinking. "I'm losing them, Marcus. I can feel it. Don't give up. Fight." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. With what? I'm drowning in debt. I can't even afford a decent apartment. Sarah's already moved in with Robert. A 4-bedroom house in the suburbs, private school for Emma, tutors for Noah. How do I compete with that? Marcus had no answer. The final custody hearing was 6 months after Sarah had asked for the divorce. James had managed to secure a junior position at a small architecture firm, but the salary was half what he'd made before, and it had come too late. The judge, a tired woman in her 60s, listened to both sides and delivered her verdict with bureaucratic efficiency. Primary custody to Sarah, with James granted visitation every other weekend and 1 evening per week. Child support payments that would take most of his paycheck. The judge noted that while James's devotion during his ex-wife's illness was commendable, the children's best interests required stability, which Sarah and her new partner could provide. James sat in the courtroom after everyone had left, staring at the wood paneling and feeling nothing. He'd fought cancer alongside Sarah, had won that impossible battle, only to lose everything that mattered anyway. The irony was crushing. That night, alone in his studio apartment that smelled of mildew and defeat, James found Emma's old sketchbook, one she'd left behind during a visit. He opened it carefully, as if the pages might crumble. The images inside were dark, abstract, figures reaching toward each other across impossible distances, faces obscured by shadows, a single tree standing alone in a vast empty field. On the last page, Emma had written in careful script, "I don't understand why love isn't enough." James closed the book and allowed himself to cry properly for the first time since this began. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and primal, mourning not just his marriage but his children's innocence, the future he'd envisioned, the person he used to be. When the tears finally stopped, he made a decision. He couldn't change the custody arrangement, couldn't undo Sarah's betrayal, couldn't reclaim the time he'd lost with Emma and Noah, but he could refuse to disappear. He could show up for every visit, every school event he was allowed to attend, every moment his children would let him be present. He would rebuild his career not out of spite but out of love, to prove that sacrifice wasn't weakness, that devotion wasn't foolishness. He would survive this just as Sarah had survived cancer. Not because he wanted to, but because Emma and Noah deserved a father who didn't give up, even when the world felt designed to break him. James pulled out his laptop and began searching for clients, for opportunities, for any way forward. Outside his window, the city lights blazed against the darkness, indifferent and eternal. He would be like those lights, constant, persistent, refusing to go out. 3 years passed like water through James's fingers, too fast and too slow simultaneously. Emma turned 15, Noah 11. James saw them in snatches, stolen moments that felt both precious and insufficient. The every other weekend arrangement became his entire world. His calendar marked not by months but by visits, by the days when his apartment transformed from a lonely box into something resembling a home. He'd moved to a better place after 2 years of relentless work, a 2-bedroom in a decent neighborhood with a small balcony where he'd set up a telescope for Noah, who developed an obsession with astronomy. Emma's room had proper art supplies, a drawing desk by the window where light flooded in during mornings. James couldn't compete with Robert's house, but he'd built something genuine, something that felt like them. His career had recovered slowly but steadily. The small firm had recognized his talent, his work ethic forged in the fire of survival. He'd been promoted twice, given projects that challenged him, reminded him why he'd chosen architecture in the first place. He designed a community center for a low-income neighborhood, a building that prioritized natural light and open spaces, places where people could gather and heal. The project won an award, and James's name started circulating again in professional circles. The money came back not all at once but in increments that allowed him to breathe. He paid down the medical debt, sent checks to Marcus to repay the loans, rebuilt his savings account from nothing. Financial stability didn't erase the loss, but it gave him ground to stand on. Sarah married Robert in an outdoor ceremony James heard about through Emma, who described it with the detached observation of someone who'd learned to protect herself by not feeling too much. Noah had been the ring bearer, uncomfortable in a small suit, and Emma had played piano during the reception. James had looked at the photos Emma reluctantly showed him and felt only a distant ache, the phantom pain of an old wound. The relationship between James and his children evolved in complicated ways. Emma, navigating adolescence, began to see the situation with more nuanced eyes. She'd ask him questions now, careful, probing questions about why he'd quit his job, what those months had been like, whether he regretted his choices. James answered honestly, never bad-mouthing Sarah but never pretending it hadn't hurt. "I'd make the same choices again," he told Emma one Saturday while they sat on his balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Your mother's life was worth everything I gave up. But I won't lie and say it didn't break something in me when she left." Emma was quiet for a long moment, her teenage face thoughtful in the fading light. "She tells a different story, you know. She says you suffocated her, made her illness your whole identity, that she had to escape to find herself again." "Maybe that's her truth," James said carefully. "People can experience the same events very differently. I thought I was loving her. She felt trapped. Both things can be real." "That's very mature of you, Dad." Emma's voice held a note of something, respect, maybe, or surprise. "I've had 3 years to work on it." James smiled sadly. "And a lot of therapy." That was true. He'd started seeing a counselor after the divorce finalized, a compassionate woman named Dr. Rivera who'd helped him untangle the knots of anger, grief, and wounded pride. She taught him that he could honor his sacrifice without requiring gratitude, that his worth wasn't determined by Sarah's choices, that loving his children meant letting them form their own understanding of what had happened. Noah remained more straightforward in his affections, still young enough to love both parents without feeling he had to choose sides. He'd bounce into James's apartment with stories about school, friends, the stray cat that hung around Robert's house. Robert was kind to Noah, James could admit that. It would have been easier, in some perverse way, if Robert had been cruel, if James could paint him as a villain. But Robert was just a man who'd fallen for a woman and had the resources to give her the life she wanted. One evening, during a rare midweek dinner when Sarah had a work conflict, Noah looked up from his spaghetti and asked, "Dad, did you really save Mom's life?" James set down his fork, choosing his words carefully. "I helped take care of her when she was very sick. Your mom is alive because of doctors and medicine and her own strength. I just made sure she got what she needed. Mom says you gave up too much, that you shouldn't have. Your mom and I disagree about that." James reached across the table, tapping Noah's nose gently, making him giggle. "But here's what matters, buddy. I love you and your sister more than anything in this world. The choices I made meant your mom survived to be your mom. That's never something I'll regret." Noah nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his pasta. But James knew these questions would keep coming, would evolve as his children grew and developed their own moral frameworks. He could only hope that by showing up consistently, by loving them without conditions, he'd give them enough foundation to weather their own confusions about loyalty and love. The holidays were the hardest. James had Christmas Eve while Sarah and Robert got Christmas Day, and the asymmetry felt deliberate, a reminder of his diminished role. But he made Christmas Eve magical, lights strung throughout the apartment, cookies they'd baked together with Emma carefully following recipes and Noah stealing dough, movies and laughter, and the kind of presents that couldn't be bought with Robert's money. Marcus and his family came over for these celebrations, creating a broader sense of belonging. Emma adored her cousins, and Noah worshipped Marcus's teenage son, following him around with puppy dog devotion. These gatherings reminded James that family wasn't just biology or legal arrangements. It was the people who showed up, who stayed, who chose you again and again. On a cold February evening, Emma asked James to come to her school's art show. Sarah and Robert would be there too, she warned, but Emma had 3 pieces on display and wanted him to see them. James agreed immediately, despite the discomfort of navigating his ex-wife's new life. The school gallery was crowded with proud parents and bored siblings. James spotted Sarah across the room, her arm linked with Robert's, both of them looking prosperous and content. Sarah had cut her hair short, wore clothes that spoke of boutiques rather than department stores. She looked healthy, vibrant, fully recovered. James felt a complicated mixture of gladness and grief. Emma's work was displayed in the advanced student section. 3 large charcoal drawings, each one stunning in its technical skill and emotional depth. The first showed a man sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, head in his hands, the shadows around him rendered with such careful attention that James could feel the exhaustion radiating from the figure. The second depicted 2 children standing between 2 houses, their faces turned toward one house, smaller, simpler with longing. The third was a portrait. It took James a moment to recognize himself, but there he was, older than he'd been 3 years ago, tired around the eyes, but with something unbroken in his expression. Emma had titled it Steady. James stood in front of that portrait for a long time, people flowing around him like water around a stone. When he finally looked up, Emma was beside him, watching him with nervous anticipation. "It's beautiful," James said, his voice thick. "You're so talented, Em." "I wanted to show what I see," Emma said quietly. "Mom has Robert and the big house and everything, but you're steady. You're always there. That's worth something too." James pulled his daughter into a hug, not caring who was watching. "It's worth everything to me." Sarah and Robert approached then, and the moment fractured into polite conversation and strained civility. But James carried Emma's words and her portrait with him like armor. His children saw him, not the version Sarah told, not the failure her lawyer had argued. They saw who he actually was, imperfect, struggling but present. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, as important things often do. James was 5 years past the divorce, firmly established in his rebuilt life, when Emma called him on a Wednesday afternoon. She was 17 now, making college plans, carrying herself with the self-possession of someone who'd grown up too fast but had emerged stronger for it. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something. Can I come over?" She arrived an hour later, her expression troubled in a way that made James's protective instincts flare. They sat on his balcony with hot chocolate, the early spring air still carrying winter's bite. "Mom and Robert are splitting up," Emma said without preamble. James processed this, surprised by his own lack of satisfaction. 5 years ago, this news might have felt like vindication. Now it just felt sad. "I'm sorry, Em. Are you okay?" "I'm fine. It's been coming for a while." Emma wrapped her hands around her mug. He wasn't what she thought he'd be. Turns out motivational speakers are better at inspiration than actual everyday partnership. Who knew? James heard the bitterness in her voice, the protective sarcasm. "Your mom will be okay. She's strong. She wants to talk to you." That surprised him. "About what?" She didn't say. "But Dad." Emma met his eyes directly. I'm old enough now to understand what really happened, what you gave up, what she did to you, and I'm angry about it. Emma, let me finish. She set down her mug, her hands trembling slightly. I used to think you were the problem somehow, that you'd failed in some way I couldn't see. Mom was good at suggesting that without saying it directly. But I'm 17, and I'm not stupid. You sacrificed everything to save her life, and she repaid you by taking everything else, including us. You were never taken from me, James said firmly. I've been your father every single day, even the days I couldn't see you. I know that now, and I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner. Emma's voice cracked. Noah and we talked about it, about how you always showed up, how you never badmouthed Mom even though you had every right to, how you rebuilt your whole life and never made us feel guilty about living with them. James felt his throat tighten. That's what parents do. We protect our kids, even when it costs us. That's what good parents do, Emma corrected. Mom protected herself. There's a difference. Sarah called that evening, her voice tentative in a way James hadn't heard in years. She asked if they could meet for coffee, just to talk. James agreed, curiosity outweighing caution. They met at a neutral cafe, both of them arriving early and ordering drinks that went cold as they navigated the minefield of their shared history. Sarah looked older, not in a bad way, but in the way of someone who'd lived through consequences. The smugness James remembered from the divorce proceedings was gone, replaced by something more weathered. Thank you for meeting me, Sarah began. I know I have no right to ask for your time. You're the mother of my children. You'll always have some claim on my time. James kept his tone neutral, not cold but not warm either. Sarah looked at her latte, and James saw her hands shake slightly. Robert and I are getting divorced. I'm sure Emma told you. She mentioned it. He wasn't who I thought he was. Or maybe I wasn't who he thought I was. Either way, it didn't work. She paused, gathering courage. I need to say something, and I need you to just listen. Can you do that? James nodded. I was wrong. About everything. Sarah's voice dropped to almost a whisper. What I did to you after you saved my life, it was cruel. It was selfish. I convinced myself I deserved better, that survival meant I could take whatever I wanted without consequences. I blamed you for choices I asked you to make, and I punished you for loving me the way you did. James sat very still, afraid that if he moved, she'd stop, and he needed to hear this. Needed the acknowledgement like oxygen. Cancer broke something in me, Sarah continued. Not just physically. It made me desperate to feel alive, to feel like I was more than a sick person. And instead of working through that with you, instead of appreciating what we'd survived together, I ran toward the first person who made me feel powerful again. Robert treated me like I was special, like I was this triumphant survivor. You treated me like your wife who'd been through hell. I wanted the fantasy, not the reality. Why are you telling me this now? James asked quietly. Because I owe you the truth. Because our children deserve to hear their mother acknowledge what their father actually did. Sarah finally looked at him, and her eyes were wet. Because I've spent 5 years watching you show up for Emma and Noah with nothing but love. No bitterness, no grudges. You gave them stability even when I'd taken everything else. You were the parent they could count on, and I took that for granted. You were there too, James said, surprising himself by meaning it. I was physically present. But you were steady. Emma's word for you, and it's perfect. You were steady when I was chaos. You rebuilt while I was busy pretending the past hadn't happened. Sarah wiped at her eyes. I can't undo what I did. I can't give you back those years with our kids, or your career, or your savings. But I can tell you I'm sorry. I'm profoundly, completely sorry. James felt the apology settle into the places that had been raw for so long. It didn't erase the pain, didn't make the injustice fair, but it acknowledged the wound. That mattered more than he'd expected. I appreciate you saying that, James said finally. I won't pretend it doesn't help to hear it. But Sarah, I need you to know I didn't do what I did to earn gratitude. I did it because you're the mother of my children and because once upon a time, I loved you enough to give everything. That doesn't mean you owed me your future. That's more grace than I deserve. Maybe, but I'm tired of carrying anger. It's been heavy enough. James finished his cold coffee, grimacing at the taste. For what it's worth, I'm glad you survived. I'm glad you're healthy. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. I don't know that I deserve to find it. That's not for me to decide. But our kids need their mom to be whole. Work on that. Be the parent they deserve, the one I know you can be. They talked for another hour, carefully excavating the ruins of their marriage, finding not reconciliation but something like mutual understanding. Sarah asked about his work, his life, whether he'd found anyone. James told her about his projects, his small apartment that felt like home, his contentment with solitude. He didn't mention the few dates he'd had, the careful ways he'd learned to trust again in small increments. When they parted, Sarah hugged him, brief and formal, but genuine. Thank you for being who you are. Emma and Noah are lucky to have you. James walked back to his car feeling lighter than he had in years. The vindication he'd thought he wanted turned out to be less important than the simple acknowledgement of truth. Sarah had finally seen what he'd given, what it had cost, and what he'd become despite everything. That evening, both Emma and Noah were at his apartment for dinner, a rare midweek occurrence that Sarah had facilitated without being asked. They made pasta together, the three of them moving around the kitchen in comfortable synchrony, laughing at Noah's terrible jokes and Emma's running commentary on her classmates' drama. After Noah went to bed, Emma lingered in the living room while James cleaned up. She was leaving for college in a few months, had chosen a school 6 hours away with an excellent art program. James was proud and terrified in equal measure. Mom told you she was sorry, didn't she? Emma asked. She did. Are you okay? James dried his hands and joined his daughter on the couch. Yeah, I am. It doesn't fix everything, but it helps. Mostly, I'm okay because of you and your brother. You two are my best accomplishment, my best art. Everything else is just details. Emma leaned against his shoulder, still his little girl despite her height and sophistication. You're going to be okay when I leave for school, right? You won't be too lonely? I'll miss you desperately, James said honestly. But I'll be fine. I've learned how to be alone without being lonely. And you'll be home for holidays and we'll video chat. And I'll embarrass you by visiting too often. You better, Emma said fiercely. You better, Emma said fiercely. And Dad, when I have kids someday, I want to be the kind of parent you are. The kind who stays. James kissed the top of her head, blinking back tears. You'll be even better, Em. You've learned from both of us what to do and what not to do. They sat together in comfortable silence, the city sounds drifting through the open window. James thought about the journey that had brought him here, the horror of Sarah's diagnosis, the desperate fight for her survival, the betrayal that had nearly destroyed him, and the slow, painful reconstruction of a life he hadn't planned but had learned to inhabit with grace. He'd lost so much, but sitting here with his daughter, knowing his son slept peacefully down the hall, understanding that he'd built something real from the ashes, it felt like a kind of winning he hadn't known existed. 2 years later, James stood in the audience of Emma's college art gallery, watching his daughter give a speech about her senior exhibition. She'd titled the collection What Remains, and it explored themes of sacrifice, resilience, and the invisible architecture of family. Several pieces featured him. Not just his face, but his essence, the steadiness she'd named years ago rendered in charcoal and paint and mixed media. Noah, now 13 and shooting up like a weed, stood beside James with his phone out, recording his sister with the devotion of a younger sibling who'd finally learned to appreciate his older sister's coolness. Sarah stood on James's other side, and Robert was notably absent. Their divorce finalized, their co-parenting relationship cordial but distant. Emma spoke about her father's sacrifice with clarity and pride, about watching him rebuild from nothing, about learning that love isn't always dramatic or celebrated, but sometimes quiet and constant. Her words were public acknowledgement of everything James had done, everything he'd been, and he felt the vindication he'd stopped seeking wash over him unexpectedly. After the speech, as people crowded around Emma to congratulate her, James slipped outside for air. Marcus found him there, having driven 3 hours to attend the show. "You did good, little brother," Marcus said, clapping James on the back. "Those kids turned out pretty damn amazing." "They raised themselves mostly," James said, but he was smiling. "Nah, you showed up. Every time you showed up. That's what mattered." James looked back through the gallery windows at his children. Emma radiant in her success. Noah awkwardly proud and trying to hide it. Sarah was talking to them, and the three of them looked like a family, which they were, just not the configuration he'd once imagined. He'd saved Sarah's life with every resource he had. She'd broken his heart and taken his children and nearly destroyed him. But he'd survived that too, had built something new from the wreckage, had loved his children through every obstacle, and had taught them, through example rather than words, what it meant to endure. The story didn't have the ending he'd wanted. Sarah hadn't come back to him, hadn't realized he was the one she needed all along. Life wasn't a romance novel. But the story had an ending he could live with. His children knew him, saw him, loved him. He'd rebuilt his career and his self-respect. He'd learned to carry his scars without letting them define him. Emma emerged from the gallery, Noah trailing behind her, both of them looking for him. When they spotted him, their faces lit up with uncomplicated joy, and James felt his heart expand with a love so fierce it was almost painful. "Dad," Noah called out. "Emma says we can all go for pizza. You coming?" James walked toward his children, toward the future they'd build together, toward all the ordinary moments that would form the real architecture of their lives. He'd fought cancer and won. He'd fought for his children and won, though not in the way he'd expected. He'd fought to become someone he could respect again, and that battle was still ongoing, but he was winning more days than he lost. "Yeah, buddy," James said, wrapping an arm around Noah's shoulders and accepting Emma's hug. "I'm coming. I'm always coming." And as they walked together toward the pizza place down the street, Sarah following at a respectful distance, James understood that this was his victory. Not the dramatic triumph of a cancer survivor ringing the bell, but the quiet triumph of showing up, day after day, year after year, loving without condition, building without recognition, staying when everything in him wanted to run. He'd given Sarah his career, his savings, his health, and his devotion. She'd given him heartbreak and loss. But the universe had given him something back. The unshakable knowledge that he was exactly the father his children needed, exactly the man he'd needed to become. The scars remained. Some wounds never fully healed. But James Johnson had learned to live with them, to let them tell a story not of victimhood but of survival, not of betrayal but of transformation. He'd saved his wife from cancer. She'd survived and chosen another man and taken his children. But in the end, his children had chosen him back, not through legal custody or material provision, but through the deepest kind of recognition, seeing him for exactly who he was and loving him not despite his sacrifices but because of them. That was enough. It had to be enough. And somehow, miraculously, it was. The city lights flickered on as evening descended, and James walked with his children into the warm glow of the restaurant, into the rest of his life, carrying his hard-won peace like a treasure he'd learned to protect. He was steady. He would always be steady, and that, in the end, was the greatest gift he could give. If the story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful true stories about sacrifice, resilience, and the quiet strength it takes to keep going when life breaks you. Every week, we bring you tales of real people facing impossible choices, stories that remind us what love, betrayal, and redemption truly look like. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that believes every story deserves to be heard. Your next unforgettable journey starts now.